Jake Morrison dragged himself up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, every step sending a sharp pain through his bad knee. Another 12-hour shift at the warehouse was finally over, and all he wanted was to collapse on his worn-out couch and forget the world existed for a few hours. The elevator in his building had been broken for 2 months, but the landlord didn't care enough to fix it. Jake had stopped complaining weeks ago. At 28 years old, Jake felt about 50. The war had done that to him. 3 tours overseas had left him with a knee that wouldn't bend right, scars that ached when it rained, and nightmares that woke him up screaming most nights. The army had thanked him for his service with a medical discharge and a disability check that barely covered rent. The warehouse job paid minimum wage and treated him like he was disposable, which he supposed he was. His apartment was exactly as depressing as he'd left it that morning. A studio that was too small, too hot in summer and too cold in winter. The paint was peeling off the walls. The refrigerator made a grinding noise that never stopped. But it was his, and it was all he could afford. Jake tossed his keys on the counter and limped toward the couch, already thinking about which frozen dinner he'd microwave for supper. That's when the air in the middle of his living room started to shimmer. Jake froze. For a second he thought his medication was finally messing with his head. The doctors had warned him about possible side effects. But the shimmer got stronger, brighter, until it looked like someone had torn a hole in reality itself. Blue light poured out, swirling and crackling with energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. His survival instincts kicked in. Jake grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and backed against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He was having some kind of episode, a breakdown, something his brain was doing because he was too tired and too broken. But then a figure stepped through the light, and Jake knew this was absolutely, terrifyingly real. The being was tall and elegant in a way that made Jake feel like he was looking at a piece of art that had come to life. Its skin seemed to shift colors, flowing from silver to pale blue like water reflecting moonlight. It wore robes that moved even though there was no wind, and its eyes were solid black, like polished stones. Beautiful and completely alien. Jake's baseball bat clattered to the floor. His mouth opened but no sound came out. The alien spoke in perfect English with no accent at all, which somehow made everything even stranger. Jacob Morrison. Please do not be alarmed. I am Ambassador Telvin of the Quarian Diplomatic Corps. I come with a message from Prince Valerian, ruler of the Quarian Empire. Jake managed to make a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a whimper. I'm losing my mind. I'm actually losing my mind. The ambassador tilted its head, studying him with those unsettling black eyes. You are not experiencing a psychological episode, Jacob Morrison. This is quite real. 4 years ago, you participated in a joint military operation on Kepler Station. Do you remember? Fragments of memory hit Jake like physical blows. The chaos. The alarm screaming. The station losing oxygen. An alien soldier in the corridor, suffocating, its breathing apparatus shattered. Jake giving up his own mask, pushing it onto the alien's face even as his own lungs started to burn. Then nothing but darkness and waking up days later in a medical bay, confused and alone. The alien, Jake whispered. Did he make it? Prince Valerian survived because of your actions. You gave him your breathing apparatus, nearly dying yourself. The prince has never forgotten this debt. He ascends to the throne in 3 days, and before he does, he wishes to honor what you did for him. Jake tried to process this. He'd saved an alien prince. An actual prince from another planet. And now, 4 years later, the prince was sending ambassadors through portals in his crappy apartment. His brain couldn't quite make sense of it. That's great, Jake said slowly. Really great. I'm glad he's okay. But you didn't need to come all this way just to say thanks. Ambassador Telvin made a gesture, and 2 more figures emerged from the portal. They were struggling with something large, something restrained by bands of glowing energy that hummed and crackled. Jake pressed himself harder against the wall. Then he saw what they were holding and his breath stopped completely. The creature was massive, easily the size of a small horse, but it moved like a wolf. 6 legs instead of 4, each ending in paws that looked powerful enough to crush stone. But it was the color that made Jake stare. The creature's fur was pure white, not the dirty white of snow, but an almost glowing alabaster that seemed to catch and hold the light. Its eyes were the strangest part, shifting from violet to gold and back again, like sunset colors trapped in glass. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Jake had ever seen. The glowing restraints dissolved, and the creature sat down in Jake's tiny living room, making the space feel impossibly small. It moved with careful precision, like it was very aware of how much room it took up and was trying not to break anything. Jake realized he was holding his breath. Ambassador Telvin gestured toward the creature with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. This is Whitepaw. He is a guardian beast from the prince's homeworld, bred from bloodlines that stretch back thousands of years. His kind are created to protect royalty, trained from birth in combat and strategy. But Whitepaw was born with a genetic anomaly. His albinism. Jake looked at the white fur, confused. What's wrong with that? On our world, albinism in guardian beasts is considered a curse from the gods, a sign of impurity and bad fortune. Whitepaw's own people rejected him. The prince's court refused to accept him as a gift. Even the breeding sanctuaries would not take him. He has nowhere to go. The creature, Whitepaw, sat perfectly still. His violet eyes were fixed on Jake, and there was something in that gaze. Something that looked almost like hope mixed with resignation, like he'd been through this rejection so many times he expected nothing else. Ambassador Telvin handed Jake a small device that looked like a tablet made of light. The prince knows what it means to be cast aside, Jacob Morrison. He believes you understand as well. Whitepaw is now under your guardianship. All documentation and care instructions are here. The prince trusts you will treat him with more dignity than our people have shown. Wait, Jake said, panic rising in his chest. I can't take care of something like this. I don't have room. I can barely feed myself. I don't know anything about alien animals. He is not an animal, the ambassador said, and there was something sharp in its voice. He is a guardian beast. There is a difference. Before Jake could argue, before he could explain all the reasons this was impossible, the portal began to close. Ambassador Telvin bowed slightly, a gesture that seemed formal and final. The prince believes you both deserve a second chance. Do not waste it. The portal snapped shut with a sound like thunder, and suddenly Jake was alone in his apartment with a six-legged alien wolf the size of a compact car. The silence that followed was so complete Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. They stared at each other. Jake pressed against the wall. Whitepaw sitting in the middle of the room, taking up most of the available space. Neither moved. Then Whitepaw spoke and Jake's world tilted sideways. Good evening, the creature said in a voice that was deep and somehow refined, with better grammar than most people Jake knew. I apologize for the intrusion into your home. I understand this situation is highly irregular and probably very frightening for you. Jake slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his bad knee forgotten. He stared at the wolf who had just spoken to him in perfect English. You can talk. I can indeed. I have spent considerable time studying your language and culture. I find Earth literature quite fascinating, particularly your fiction writers. I am currently working through your science fiction genre, which I find somewhat amusing given my current circumstances. You read books. I had very little else to do for 20 years. When one is locked away and considered cursed, books become rather essential for maintaining sanity. There was something bitter in Whitepaw's tone, something that spoke of long years and deep loneliness. Jake started laughing. He couldn't help it. The sound came out half hysterical, the kind of laughter that happens when your brain just gives up trying to make sense of things. He laughed until tears ran down his face, until his stomach hurt, until the absurdity of it all became almost manageable. The talking alien wolf, in his apartment, who read science fiction. When he finally stopped, Whitepaw was watching him with those shifting violet eyes, his head tilted slightly. Are you quite all right? No, Jake said honestly. I'm really not. This is insane. Completely insane. I cannot disagree with that assessment. They sat in silence for a moment. Jake studied the creature, really looked at him. Beneath the massive size and the alien features, there was something familiar in Whitepaw's posture. The way he held himself carefully, like he was trying to take up less space. The guardedness in his eyes. The expectation of rejection. Jake knew that feeling. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning since coming home from the war. So what happens now? Jake asked finally. I suppose that depends on you. You could contact your authorities and have me removed. I would not blame you. This is your home and I am an unwelcome intrusion. And where would they take you? Whitepaw's ears flattened slightly against his head. Nowhere good. But that is not your concern. You did not ask for this burden. Jake thought about it. He thought about his empty apartment, his dead-end job, his life that felt like it was going nowhere. He thought about being the guy nobody wanted around, the broken veteran people crossed the street to avoid. He knew exactly what it felt like to be the burden nobody asked for. Which side of the room do you want? Jake asked. Whitepaw's ears shot forward in surprise. You are allowing me to stay? Do I have a choice? You could refuse. Yeah, but I'm not going to. Jake pulled himself to his feet, wincing as his knee protested. I've been the guy nobody wanted. I'm not doing that to someone else. Even if that someone is a giant talking wolf from outer space. For the first time since arriving, Whitepaw's rigid posture relaxed just slightly. Thank you, Jacob Morrison. You have no idea what that means to me. Call me Jake. And we need to figure out sleeping arrangements because there's no way you're fitting on my couch. The first morning after Whitepaw arrived, Jake woke up convinced the whole thing had been a fever dream. Maybe he'd fallen asleep on the couch and imagined the portal, the ambassador, the giant talking wolf. It would make more sense than what he remembered. Then he opened his eyes and saw Whitepaw curled up in the corner of the room, his white fur practically glowing in the early morning light. The wolf's 6 legs were tucked beneath him in a way that should have looked strange but somehow didn't. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and steady. For a moment, Jake just stared, his brain still trying to catch up with his new reality. This was his life now. He lived with an alien wolf who spoke better English than most people and read classic literature for fun. Jake's stomach growled, reminding him he'd skipped dinner last night in all the chaos. He quietly got up and headed to the kitchen area, trying not to wake Whitepaw. He opened the refrigerator and stared at the depressing contents. 2 frozen dinners, half a carton of milk that was probably expired, and some leftover takeout he didn't trust anymore. Good morning. Whitepaw's deep voice came from behind him, making Jake jump and nearly drop the milk carton. Morning, Jake managed, his heart still racing. You, hungry? I appreciate the offer, but I should probably explain my dietary requirements before you attempt to feed me human food. Jake closed the refrigerator and turned around. Whitepaw had moved to sit near the window, where the morning sun caught his white fur and made him look almost ethereal. Okay, so what do you eat? Whitepaw's ears flicked back slightly, a gesture Jake was starting to recognize as embarrassment. That is somewhat complicated. Guardian beasts require a specific mineral compound found in the soil of our homeworld. It's crystalline in nature and needs to be processed into a supplement. The ambassador should have included information about this. Jake grabbed the glowing tablet the ambassador had given him and started scrolling through it. His stomach sank as he found the dietary section. The supplements Whitepaw needed cost $400 a week. Jake's entire monthly food budget was about $150. This can't be right, Jake muttered, reading the numbers again. I apologize, Whitepaw said quietly. I did not choose these requirements. If you cannot afford them, I understand. You should contact the authorities. Stop saying that, Jake snapped, then immediately felt bad about his tone. Sorry? I'm not mad at you. I'm just trying to figure this out. He spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. The official channels were useless. Nobody wanted to help with an unregistered alien creature's dietary needs. Finally, on a hunch, Jake called an old army buddy who'd mentioned something about black market alien goods in the city. That's how he ended up in a basement shop in Chinatown that afternoon, standing across from a woman named Rita who looked him up and down like she was calculating his net worth. Guardian beast, Rita said, not even glancing at Whitepaw, who'd had to duck to fit through the doorway. Albino variant. You know how rare these are. He's not for sale, Jake said flatly. Rita laughed, showing a gold tooth that glinted in the dim light. Relax, soldier boy. I don't deal in people. Bad karma and worse business. But those supplements you need? Gonna cost you. They negotiated for an hour. Rita wanted cash Jake didn't have. Finally, they worked out a deal. Jake would provide security for her shop 2 nights a week, and Rita would give them the supplements at cost. It wasn't ideal, but it kept them both alive. The second problem showed up 3 days later when Mrs. Patterson from apartment 3B started banging on Jake's door at 2 in the morning. What is that noise? She shrieked when Jake opened the door, bleary-eyed and confused. It sounds like demons. I'm calling the police. Jake had no idea what she was talking about until he went back inside and found Whitepaw in the corner, making a low melodic sound that rose and fell in patterns that were almost like singing. It was beautiful and definitely not English. What are you doing? Jake asked. Whitepaw stopped immediately, his ears flattening. I apologize. I did not mean to disturb anyone. I was reciting poetry in my native language. It helps when I cannot sleep. You have trouble sleeping? I spent 20 years in isolation, Jake. The silence at night is difficult. The poetry helps me remember I still exist. Jake understood that more than he wanted to admit. How many nights had he lain awake, the quiet feeling like it would swallow him whole? Can you maybe do it quieter? The neighbors are freaking out. Of course. Again, I apologize. The landlord showed up the next morning red-faced and angry. Mr. Kowalski took one look at White Paw and started yelling about violations and evictions and calling animal control. Jake cut him off by shoving the forged documentation Rita had provided into his hands. Service animal. For my PTSD. It's all legal, covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's not a dog. The law doesn't specify species, sir. You want to argue with federal disability regulations? Be my guest. But I should warn you, discrimination against service animals can result in some pretty serious lawsuits. Mr. Kowalski's face went through several colors before he finally stormed off, muttering about raising the rent. Jake closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted. I am causing you considerable trouble, White Paw said softly. Yeah, well, get in line. My whole life is trouble lately. Despite the chaos, Jake started noticing things. Good things. White Paw moved through the apartment with incredible grace, his 6 legs allowing him to navigate the cramped space without knocking anything over. He was naturally quiet, his footsteps making no sound at all. And his senses were extraordinary. One evening, Jake was cooking dinner when White Paw's head suddenly lifted. Your landlord is coming up the stairs. He has another person with him. They are discussing inspection procedures. How do you know that? I can hear their conversation. They are 3 floors down. Sure enough, 2 minutes later, Mr. Kowalski knocked on the door with a building inspector. Jake had just enough time to hide the more obviously alien aspects of their living situation. The inspector found nothing wrong, but Jake's heart didn't stop racing until they left. The biggest surprise came about 2 weeks in. Jake had another nightmare, the usual one about the explosion that had torn through his unit. He woke up gasping, his heart hammering, sweat soaking through his shirt. He was reaching for his phone to call the VA crisis line when he realized White Paw was sitting next to his bed, those violet eyes watching him with concern. You were crying out in your sleep? White Paw said quietly. Yeah. Sorry if I woke you. You did not. I was already awake. The wolf settled down on the floor next to Jake's bed, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than threatening. I have nightmares too. Different content, I imagine, but the same feeling. The fear that will not let you rest. What do you have nightmares about? Being back in the cage. Being told I am worthless, cursed, wrong. Being invisible while people discuss my fate as if I am not there. White Paw's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jake heard the pain underneath. The nightmares where I scream and no one hears me are the worst. They sat in the dark together, 2 broken souls who'd found each other by accident. Jake's breathing slowly returned to normal. The panic that usually kept him awake for hours started to fade. Thank you, Jake said. For what? For being here. For understanding. You gave me a home when no one else would. It is the least I can do. After that night, the nightmares didn't stop, but they became more manageable. White Paw would position himself near Jake's bed, his quiet breathing a reminder that Jake wasn't alone. Sometimes they would talk until dawn, sharing stories about their different worlds and their similar experiences of rejection. Jake learned that White Paw had been born into one of the most prestigious guardian bloodlines on his planet. He should have been celebrated, trained, bonded with royalty. Instead, his white fur made him an outcast from birth. The other guardians wouldn't train with him. The royal family kept him alive only because Prince Valerian insisted, but they hid him away like a shameful secret. I became obsessed with learning, White Paw explained one night. If I could not be valuable for what I was born to be, perhaps I could be valuable for what I knew. I studied everything I could access. Languages, philosophy, literature, history. I memorized entire books. It gave me purpose when everything else was taken from me. That's why you talk like you swallowed a dictionary, Jake said, not unkindly. I suppose formal education has its drawbacks in casual conversation. Nah, it's kinda cool actually. Makes me feel like I'm living with a professor who happens to be a giant wolf. White Paw's ears perked up, and Jake realized it might have been the first time anyone called anything about him cool. As the 3rd week arrived, Jake had to admit things were working. It wasn't easy and it definitely wasn't normal, but they were figuring it out. White Paw helped around the apartment, his intelligence making him a surprisingly good roommate. He learned Jake's schedule and would have coffee ready in the morning. He organized the chaos of Jake's paperwork, his careful paws somehow managing to sort documents better than Jake ever had. Most importantly, Jake didn't feel alone anymore. For the first time since coming home from the war, his apartment felt like more than just a place to sleep. Felt like a home. But homes cost money, and money was something Jake was rapidly running out of. Jake's supervisor called him into the office on a Tuesday morning, and he knew before walking through the door that his life was about to get worse. The man wouldn't meet his eyes, kept shuffling papers on his desk like they were the most interesting things in the world. "Look, Morrison, this isn't personal," his supervisor started, which meant it absolutely was personal. "We're making some cuts. Budget issues. Last hired, first fired. You understand." Jake understood perfectly. They were firing him because his knee slowed him down on the line. Because he sometimes had to take breaks when his old injuries flared up. Because he'd had 2 panic attacks in the break room, and that made people uncomfortable. The Americans with Disabilities Act was supposed to protect him, but companies always found ways around it. He cleaned out his locker without saying goodbye to anyone and walked home in the rain. By the time he reached his apartment, he was soaked through and his knee was screaming. White Paw was waiting by the door, his posture immediately alert. "Something happened," White Paw said. "It wasn't a question." "Lost my job." Jake dropped onto the couch, water dripping onto the floor. "We're officially screwed." White Paw was quiet for a moment, those violet eyes studying Jake with obvious concern. Then he moved closer, settling down so his massive head was level with Jake's. "I have a proposal, though you may think it is foolish. Can't be more foolish than my current situation. Your world has private security companies, correct? Businesses that provide protection services to those who need them. Yeah, but I'm just an infantry grunt with a bad knee. No company's going to hire me for anything serious." "Perhaps not you alone," White Paw said carefully. "But what about us together? I was bred and trained as a guardian beast. For 20 years, my skills went unused because of how I look. But the skills are still there, Jake. I can detect threats through walls. I can hear heartbeats from 50 feet away. I can analyze tactical situations faster than most of your computers. My presence alone intimidates most potential aggressors. And you have combat experience, leadership training, and an understanding of human behavior that I lack." Jake sat up straighter, his brain starting to work through the possibilities. "You're talking about starting our own security business?" "I'm talking about using what we have. We are both considered worthless by those who should have valued us. Perhaps it is time we prove them wrong." It was crazy. They had no money, no equipment, no reputation. But crazy was starting to feel like Jake's specialty lately. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. Old army buddies, guys from his unit who'd stayed in touch. One of them, Tommy Barrett, had mentioned something about security work in the industrial district. Jake called him. Tommy picked up on the 3rd ring. "Jake? Man, it's been forever. What's up? You still know that guy who runs the warehouses on Porter Street? The ones that keep getting hit by thieves? Bill Peterson? Yeah, why? Think he'd be interested in some security help?" 20 minutes later, Jake had a meeting set up for that evening. Tommy had vouched for him, which got his foot in the door. The rest would be up to Jake and White Paw to prove themselves. Bill Peterson was a big guy with a permanent scowl and hands that looked like they could crush concrete. He ran a storage facility that held expensive equipment for construction companies, and he'd been robbed 3 times in 2 months. The local cops couldn't do much, and the regular security companies he'd hired were useless. He took one look at White Paw and his eyes went wide. "What in the hell is that?" "Guardian beast," Jake said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "Trained for security and protection work. Give us 1 week, no charge. If we don't perform better than what you've got now, you owe us nothing." Bill stared at White Paw, who sat perfectly still, his violet eyes calm and intelligent. "It talks." "He talks," Jake corrected. "And he's probably smarter than both of us combined. I assure you I am quite capable of fulfilling protection duties," White Paw added in his deep, refined voice. "My sensory capabilities far exceed human norms, and I am trained in threat assessment and tactical response." Bill looked between them, clearly trying to decide if he was being pranked. Finally he shrugged. "What the hell? Can't be worse than what I got now. 1 week. But if that thing eats anybody, I'm suing." "He doesn't eat people," Jake said. "I find human flesh unappetizing," White Paw added helpfully. Their first night on the job, Jake was nervous enough to throw up. They positioned themselves in the main warehouse, lights off, waiting. Jake had his phone ready to call the cops if needed. White Paw sat motionless in the shadows, practically invisible despite his white fur. At 2 in the morning, White Paw's ears suddenly swiveled toward the east side of the building. 3 individuals approaching. Approximately 200 feet away. They are communicating via radio. I can hear their transmissions. They are discussing entry points and dividing responsibilities. How do you know all that? I can hear their heartbeats and distinguish individual vocal patterns. The radio frequencies are audible to me. They are armed with plasma-cutting tools. I smell the ozone discharge. Jake grabbed his flashlight and radio. What's the play? I suggest a flanking maneuver. You position yourself at the north entrance. I will approach from the south and herd them toward your location. They will be looking for a conventional security response, not a coordinated tactical action. It worked perfectly. White Paw moved through the darkness like he was part of it, his 6 legs making absolutely no sound. Jake heard the thieves start shouting in panic, their voices high with fear. They came running straight toward the north entrance, right where Jake was waiting with his flashlight and phone. Security? Stop right there. Police are on the way. The 3 thieves froze, blinded by the flashlight. Behind them, White Paw emerged from the shadows, his white fur catching the light and making him look like some kind of ghost. One of the thieves actually screamed. They surrendered immediately. Jake kept them secured until the cops arrived, and the whole thing was over in less than 10 minutes. When Bill showed up the next morning and saw the police report, he stared at Jake with something like respect. You got them all? No damage, no injuries? Clean takedown. They never even got inside. You're hired. Permanent contract. Name your price. Word spread fast in the business community. A veteran and his trained alien guardian beast who actually stopped crime instead of just watching it happen. Within 2 weeks they had 3 more clients. Within a month they were turning down work because they couldn't handle it all. Jake moved them out of the cramped studio into a small house with a fenced yard. It wasn't fancy, but it had space for White Paw to move around, and there was actual grass. White Paw immediately claimed a corner of the yard and started digging. What are you doing? Jake asked, watching the wolf carefully excavate a section of dirt. Starting a garden. I find your earth plants fascinating. On my world, flora draws energy from crystalline minerals. Your photosynthesis is so beautifully inefficient, I wish to understand it better. Within weeks, White Paw had tomato plants growing. He would spend his free time tending them with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something his size. Jake would come home from supply runs and find White Paw carefully pruning leaves, talking to the plants in his deep voice about proper growth techniques. You know they can't understand you, right? Perhaps not in the way you and I communicate, but they respond to stimuli. Besides, it gives me something to nurture. I was never allowed to create anything before. Only to guard and protect what others built. Life was actually getting better. Jake had purpose again. The money wasn't amazing, but it was steady and enough to live on. White Paw seemed happier, more confident. They were building something real together, proving that the people who'd rejected them were wrong. Then Jake ran into Captain Reeves at a veterans networking event, and everything started falling apart. Reeves owned a competing security company, one of the big established ones. He'd been Jake's commanding officer during his last deployment, the man who'd written Jake up constantly for questioning orders, who'd blocked his promotion, who'd made it clear Jake was a disappointment to the uniform. Morrison, Reeves said, his smile cold and sharp. Heard you've been playing security guard with some kind of alien pet. That's cute. It's a legitimate business, sir. Is it? Because I've been doing some research on alien immigration law. Turns out, unregistered alien creatures operating commercial enterprises is a pretty serious violation. Immigration enforcement would be very interested in your situation. Jake's blood went cold. Don't do this. You were always weak, Morrison. Couldn't hack it in the army, now you can't even make it in civilian life without your freak show doing all the work. Here's some advice. Shut down your little operation and get out of the security business. Otherwise I make some calls and your pet disappears. Permanently. Reeves walked away, leaving Jake standing there with his heart pounding and his hands shaking. When he got home, he found White Paw in the garden, his white fur dirty with soil, completely at peace. Jake's voice shook when he spoke. We've got a problem. White Paw's ears flattened immediately. They are coming for me. Not if I can stop them. Jake, I am illegal. I have no papers, no citizenship, no rights in your world. I am classified as fauna, as property. If they come, then we fight. I didn't save you from one cage just to let them throw you in another. But as Jake researched immigration law that night, his hope crumbled. The regulations were brutal and clear. Unregistered alien creatures could be detained and deported without appeal. There were no exceptions. Unless they could prove White Paw wasn't a creature at all. Jake spent 3 sleepless nights researching immigration law, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, his eyes burning from staring at the computer screen. Every legal document he found made their situation look worse. Unregistered alien fauna had 0 rights under Earth law. They could be detained without warrant, held without trial, and deported without appeal. It was designed to handle invasive species and dangerous animals, not beings who could speak 5 languages and quote philosophy. But there was one thing Jake kept finding in his research. A loophole so small he almost missed it the first time. If an alien creature could prove sapient intelligence and establish legal citizenship through an advocate, they couldn't be classified as fauna anymore. They would be considered a person under interstellar law. The problem was proving it. And they were running out of time. Whitepaw knew something was wrong. He stopped tending his garden, stopped reciting poetry at night. He would sit by the window for hours, his violet eyes watching the street like he was waiting for the inevitable. "You should turn me in," Whitepaw said one evening, his voice quiet and resigned. "Make a deal with them. Say I forced you to shelter me. They might go easier on you if you cooperate." "Are you out of your mind?" Jake snapped. "I'm not turning you over to people who'll throw you in a cage. I have been in cages before, Jake. I can survive them. That's not the point. You're not going back to that. We're going to fight this." "How?" "You said yourself the law is clear." Jake pulled up the information he'd found about the Interspecies Council hearing process. "There's a way. It's a long shot, but it's something. If we can get you in front of the council and prove you're sapient, they have to recognize you as a person, not property. And how do we prove that? You talk. You think. You feel. You read books and grow tomatoes and have nightmares. That's not what animals do, Whitepaw. That's what people do." Before Whitepaw could respond, his ears suddenly swiveled toward the street. Vehicles approaching. Multiple units. Heavy equipment. "They are here." Jake looked out the window and saw 3 black SUVs pulling up to the house. Men in tactical gear were already climbing out, carrying equipment that hummed with alien technology. Leading them was a man in a suit who moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Immigration Enforcement Agent Richard Strauss. Jake recognized him from the photos he'd found during his research. The man had a reputation for being thorough, patient, and absolutely merciless when it came to alien enforcement law. "Back door," Jake said, already grabbing his phone and wallet. "Now." They ran. Jake's hands shook as he called Tommy while they moved through backyards and alleys. His friend picked up on the second ring. "Tommy, I need help. Immigration is after Whitepaw. Can we crash at your place?" "How long?" "I don't know. Maybe a few days while I figure this out." There was a pause, then Tommy's voice came back solid and certain. "Come over. Back entrance. I'll leave it unlocked." Tommy's basement was finished and comfortable, with a pull-out couch and a small bathroom. Tommy's wife Claire brought down blankets and food without asking a single question, though her eyes went wide when she saw Whitepaw. "Thank you," Whitepaw said to her in his deep, polite voice. "We apologize for the intrusion." Claire blinked, looked at Tommy, then back at Whitepaw. "You talk." "I do indeed." "Okay then. There's leftover lasagna in the fridge if you get hungry. Though I'm guessing you can't eat lasagna?" "Unfortunately no. But the thought is appreciated." After Claire went back upstairs, Tommy sat down with Jake and laid it out straight. "You can stay here maybe 3 days before the neighbors start talking. What's your plan?" "Working on it," Jake said, which was only partly true. He had ideas, but they were all desperate and probably stupid. Agent Strauss wasn't going to make this easy. Jake discovered that the next morning when he checked his phone and found his bank account frozen. Strauss had gotten a judge to sign off on asset seizure, claiming Jake was harboring illegal alien contraband. Without access to money, Jake couldn't rent a hotel, couldn't buy supplies, couldn't do anything. They moved to a second safe house that afternoon. Lisa Hayes, another veteran from Jake's old unit, worked maintenance for the city and knew which buildings were scheduled for demolition. She gave them keys to an abandoned industrial complex that had maybe a week before the crews showed up. "Stay out of sight," Lisa warned. "Cameras everywhere in this city. One video of your friend goes viral, and Strauss will know exactly where you are." She was right. They made it 2 days before someone spotted Whitepaw through a window. A kid with a phone recorded 15 seconds of video showing a giant white wolf moving through the building. The video hit social media and exploded. Within hours, news outlets were running stories about the ghost wolf of the industrial district. Strauss used the video to track them. Jake didn't even hear the drones until it was too late. They were small, silent, and armed with stunning technology designed for large alien creatures. Jake caught a glimpse of one outside the window just before the blast hit. He threw himself sideways, but Whitepaw was faster. The massive wolf moved to shield Jake, putting his body between Jake and the window. The stunning blast caught Whitepaw full in the shoulder. The wolf made a sound Jake had never heard before, somewhere between a howl and a scream. His entire body convulsed and then he collapsed, 6 legs folding beneath him like someone had cut his strings. No, no, no! Jake was crawling toward White Paw before he even realized he was moving. The wolf's shoulder was torn open, blood that glowed faintly blue spreading across white fur. The wound wasn't closing. Jake pressed his hands against the injury, trying to stop the bleeding. His shirt was soaked in seconds. White Paw's eyes were open but unfocused, shifting rapidly between violet and gold like something was breaking inside him. Stay with me, Jake begged. Come on, buddy, stay with me. White Paw's voice came out weak and strained. Jake, I need to tell you something. About why the prince gave me to you. Save your strength. We need to move. Listen to me. White Paw coughed and more of that luminescent blood stained his teeth. It was not just gratitude. The prince gave me to you as a test. Not of you but of humanity. On my world I was rejected for being imperfect. You wanted to see if your people might be different. If humans could look past appearance and see worth. You're not dying. I won't let you. I am 73 years old by your counting. I have spent most of my life in cages, being told I am worthless. These months with you were the first time I felt like a person. Thank you for that gift. Jake's vision blurred with tears. He fumbled for his phone with bloody hands and called the only person he could think of. Rita, the black market dealer who'd helped them before. She showed up 40 minutes later with a medical kit that looked like something from a science fiction movie. She didn't ask questions, just got to work injecting White Paw with substances that made his fur spark and glow. He'll live, Rita said finally, sitting back on her heels. But this is temporary. He needs real medical care. The kind you can't get while running and hiding. What do you suggest? Stop running. Take this to court. There's a process for alien beings to apply for citizenship. It's brutal and the odds suck, but it's better than waiting for Strauss to put a bullet in both of you. What are our chances? Rita looked at White Paw, unconscious but breathing steadily. Maybe 10%. But that's 10% better than 0. Jake spent the next 2 days making calls. His old unit started rallying. Tommy agreed to testify about White Paw's intelligence. Lisa offered to provide documentation. Bill Peterson, the warehouse owner, volunteered to speak about their security work and how White Paw had once talked down an armed robber instead of attacking him. But they needed a lawyer, and attorneys who specialized in interspecies law charged thousands of dollars per hour. Jake had exactly $300 to his name. Then his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Jacob Morrison? The voice was professional, female, with an edge of determination. My name is Rachel Stone. I'm an attorney with the Interspecies Rights Advocacy Project. I've been following your situation. I'd like to represent you in White Paw. Pro bono. Jake's heart jumped. Why would you do that? Because if we win this case, it sets precedent for every other sentient being the government tries to classify as fauna. This isn't just about one albino wolf, Jake. It's about who gets to be considered a person. And I think that's a fight worth having. When can we start? Right now. But first, you need to do something that's going to feel wrong. You need to turn yourselves in voluntarily. We can't fight this while you're fugitives. We fight it in court with the law on our side, or we don't fight it at all. Jake looked at White Paw, who had woken and was listening with those intelligent violet eyes. The wolf nodded slightly. That evening, Jake called Agent Strauss and arranged a surrender. The agent sounded surprised but agreed to meet them at a neutral location with minimal force. They walked out together at sunset. Jake with his hands visible. White Paw moving slowly beside him, still injured but standing tall. Agent Strauss was waiting with his team, weapons drawn but not aimed. A crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the veteran community, and dozens of Jake's old unit had shown up. They stood in silent witness, arms crossed, watching everything. Strauss approached with specialized restraints designed for guardian beasts. As he fitted them onto White Paw's legs, the agent kept glancing at the crowd nervously. You're making a mistake, Morrison, Strauss said. This thing isn't a person. It's property. Alien fauna. White Paw spoke, his deep voice carrying across the parking lot. Then prove it in court, Agent Strauss. I look forward to debating the nature of personhood with you. Strauss actually stopped, surprise flickering across his face. Maybe he'd expected an animal. Maybe he'd thought the reports about White Paw talking were exaggerated. But hearing it in person, seeing the intelligence in those eyes, seemed to shake him. They loaded White Paw into a specialized transport. As the doors closed, White Paw caught Jake's eye. Do not worry about me. I have been in cages before. At least this time, someone is fighting to get me out. Jake watched the transport drive away and made a promise to himself. He would get White Paw back. Whatever it took. The Interspecies Council hearing room looked nothing like a regular courtroom. It was massive, built like an amphitheater with rows of seats rising up in a semicircle. The ceiling was some kind of transparent material that showed the sky above, and the walls had screens displaying translations in dozens of languages. Camera crews from half a dozen planets had set up equipment, their alien operators moving around with practiced efficiency. This case had become news across multiple star systems. The first time a guardian beast had challenged its classification as non-sapient property. Jake sat at the defense table next to Rachel Stone, his lawyer, wearing the only suit he owned. It was too tight in the shoulders and the pants were a bit short, but it was the best he could do. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Across the aisle sat Agent Strauss with 3 government prosecutors who looked calm and confident. They had briefcases full of evidence, expert witnesses lined up, and the full weight of immigration law behind them. Jake had Rachel, some character witnesses, and hope that was fading by the minute. Then they brought White Paw in and Jake's heart broke a little. The wolf was in restraints that glowed with suppression technology, limiting his movement to slow, careful steps. But he walked with his head high, his white fur clean and brushed, his violet eyes scanning the room with obvious intelligence. When he saw Jake, his ears perked forward just slightly. The only sign of emotion he allowed himself. The gallery was packed. Tommy and the rest of Jake's old unit filled 3 rows, all wearing their dress uniforms. Lisa sat with Bill and other business owners. Rita lounged in the back, her sharp eyes missing nothing. And in the very front row, causing whispers and shocked looks, sat Prince Valerian himself. The Quarian prince wore ceremonial armor that seemed to drink in the light, making him look like a living shadow. His presence here was basically a diplomatic incident. Ruling monarchs didn't attend legal proceedings in other systems. His black eyes were fixed on White Paw with an expression that might have been pride or might have been regret. Judge Caldwell entered, a stern woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight. She'd been presiding over interspecies cases for 20 years and had a reputation for being fair but harsh. She called the court to order with a voice that cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. This hearing will determine whether the being designated as White Paw is sapient intelligent life or alien fauna. The burden of proof lies with the defense. Let's proceed. The prosecution went first and they came out swinging. They brought in scientists who'd studied guardian beasts on their homeworld, showing videos of the creatures being trained. The experts argued that guardian beasts were genetically engineered tools, bred for specific traits like loyalty and tactical thinking, but lacking true consciousness. Dr. Nathan Cross, a behavioral scientist, took the stand and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own conclusions. Guardian beasts display impressive mimicry and learned behaviors, but these are fundamentally different from genuine self-awareness. A parrot can speak hundreds of words. A dolphin can follow complex commands. This doesn't make them persons. It makes them very intelligent animals. He showed brain scans, genetic analysis, breeding records. All of it designed to prove that White Paw was a sophisticated biological machine, nothing more. Then Captain Reeves took the stand, and Jake had to grip the edge of the table to keep from standing up and shouting. Reeves wore an expensive suit and spoke with fake concern that made Jake's skin crawl. "I've known Jacob Morrison for years," Reeves testified, not even glancing at Jake. "He's a troubled individual. Multiple psychological issues stemming from his military service. He's latched onto this creature as a coping mechanism and convinced himself it's something it's not. The truth is he's exploiting a trained animal for profit. Their so-called security business is just Morrison hiding behind a weapon he doesn't have to take responsibility for." Reeves painted a picture of Jake as mentally unstable and White Paw as a dangerous attack animal that happened to have been taught some words. The prosecutors ate it up. Even Judge Caldwell looked skeptical. Rachel cross-examined each witness, poking holes where she could, but Jake could feel the case slipping away. The prosecution's argument was solid. Guardian beasts were bred as tools. How do you prove something bred to be property deserves to be treated as a person? Then Rachel called White Paw to the stand and the courtroom exploded. Agent Strauss shot to his feet so fast his chair fell over. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The subject of these proceedings cannot testify about his own status. It's circular logic." Judge Caldwell considered for a long moment while the courtroom buzzed with argument. Finally, she raised her hand for silence. "Overruled. If this being can demonstrate comprehension and self-awareness, it's directly relevant to the question before us. I'll allow it." They removed the restraints and White Paw approached the witness stand. A special platform had been built to accommodate his size. He settled onto it with careful dignity, folding his 6 legs beneath him, his violet eyes calm despite the hundreds of people staring at him. Rachel approached gently, like she was talking to someone fragile. "Whitepaw, can you state your full name for the record?" Whitepaw's deep voice filled the chamber, clear and steady. "I was born without a name. On my world, guardian beasts receive names only after completing their training and bonding with their charge. I never received that honor. My albinism marked me as cursed from birth. I was called the Pale One, the Broken One, or most commonly, It. Jacob Morrison gave me the name Whitepaw. It was the first time anyone suggested I deserved to be called something besides a mistake." Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge Caldwell leaned forward slightly. Rachel continued. "Tell us about your education." "I was isolated for most of my life. Prince Valorian's intervention kept me alive, but I was hidden from public view. I had access to digital libraries and learning materials. I studied to fill the emptiness of my existence. Languages first, then literature, philosophy, mathematics, history. I became particularly fascinated by Earth existentialism, the idea that what we are is not determined at birth but created through our choices and actions." Rachel pulled up a display screen. "I'm showing you a passage from a book written in Russian. Can you read it?" Whitepaw read the passage aloud in fluent Russian, his pronunciation perfect. Then he translated it to English. Then he offered a detailed analysis of the author's philosophy and how it related to the theme of moral responsibility. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the prosecutors looked shaken. "Dr. Cross suggested your speech is sophisticated mimicry," Rachel said. "Is that accurate?" "If it were mimicry, I would not understand the profound irony of this trial," Whitepaw replied. His violet eyes swept the room. "I am being asked to prove I am a person to people who have already decided I am not. It is like asking someone to prove they can see color to those who have decided they are blind. The burden is impossible because the assumption is flawed from the start." "What do you mean?" "Sapience should not be measured by genetic origin or physical form. It should be measured by the capacity for self-awareness, for moral reasoning, for suffering and joy. I know that I exist. I understand that I will one day cease to exist, and that knowledge fills me with fear. I hope for things beyond my immediate survival. I dream of futures I may never see. I grieve for the years I lost to isolation." His voice grew quieter but no less powerful. "If these qualities do not define personhood, then what does? The shape of one's body? The planet of one's birth? Because if that is the standard, then personhood is not about consciousness. It is about prejudice." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake saw several jurors wiping their eyes. Even Judge Caldwell looked affected, though she maintained her professional composure. Rachel asked her final question. "Why do you want to stay on Earth?" Whitepaw's gaze found Jake in the crowd. "Because for the first time in 73 years, someone looked at me and saw a person instead of a defect. Jake Morrison gave me something my own people never did. A choice. The freedom to decide who I wanted to be. I choose to be his partner. His friend. I choose to build a life that has meaning. Is that not what all conscious beings desire?" Agent Strauss cross-examined aggressively, trying to break Whitepaw's composure. "You were bred to protect royalty. You're just following your programming with Morrison. I was bred to guard. I chose to protect. There is a fundamental difference between compulsion and choice. You eat, sleep, follow commands. These are animal behaviors. Humans eat and sleep. Humans follow laws and social norms. Does this make them animals? Or is it only when non-humans demonstrate intelligence that it becomes suspect?" Strauss's face reddened. "You're being coached. Someone taught you these answers. All communication is learned, Agent Strauss. You learned English as a child. Does that make your thoughts less genuine? Or is authenticity only questioned when the speaker is inconvenient to your worldview?" Strauss had no good response to that. Rachel called Jake next. He testified about their partnership, about late-night conversations where Whitepaw had talked him through PTSD attacks with understanding and compassion. About how Whitepaw had once spent 4 hours talking down an armed, desperate man who'd broken into a warehouse, convincing him to get help instead of doing something he couldn't take back. "He saved my life," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because he was programmed to. He did it because he cares. Because despite everything his world did to him, he still chooses kindness. That's not programming. That's character. That's a person making moral choices." Tommy testified about working alongside Whitepaw. Lisa talked about his garden and how carefully he tended each plant. Bill described White Paw's intelligence and compassion in detail. Each testimony painted the same picture of someone who thought, felt, and chose his actions deliberately. Then Prince Valerian requested permission to address the court. Judge Caldwell couldn't refuse. Diplomatic immunity gave him the right. The prince approached the stand, and his presence commanded absolute attention. "I gave White Paw to Jacob Morrison as a test," Valerian said, his voice carrying authority that made people sit up straighter. "Not of Morrison but of humanity itself. My people created guardian beasts. We bred them for intelligence and awareness because those qualities made them better protectors. Then we denied them personhood because acknowledging what we had done would require us to face our own cruelty." One of the prosecutors tried to interrupt. "Your Highness, your culture's internal policies are monstrous," Valerian cut him off. "I am not here to defend my world. I am here to expose it. Guardian beasts are sapient. We know this. We have always known this. We choose to ignore it because acknowledging their personhood would mean admitting we have engaged in slavery for generations. I gave White Paw to Morrison because I hoped humans might be better than we are. If you deport him, you prove you are not." The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. A ruling monarch had just admitted his entire species was committing what amounted to slavery. The political implications would echo for years. The judge called for a recess to deliberate. 3 days of waiting followed. Jake barely functioned. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Rachel managed to get him visiting privileges with White Paw. They sat in a sterile room separated by a force field that hummed between them. "Whatever happens," White Paw said quietly, "thank you for trying. We're going to win. And if we do not? Then I'll find you. Wherever they send you, I'll find you. I promise." White Paw's eyes shifted from violet to gold, and luminescent tears traced down his white fur. "You have already given me more than I ever hoped for. Do not make promises you cannot keep." "I keep my promises," Jake said fiercely. On the third day they were called back. Judge Caldwell looked exhausted, like she'd aged years in 72 hours. The courtroom was even more packed than before, with people standing in the aisles. "This court has reviewed all testimony and evidence," she began. "The question before us is whether intelligence alone constitutes personhood under interspecies law. The prosecution argues that genetic origin determines status. That beings bred for specific purposes cannot be fully autonomous. This court finds that argument deeply troubling and ultimately unacceptable." Jake's heart was pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. "If we accept that origin determines worth, we open doors that should remain permanently closed. Clones. Genetically modified beings. Artificial intelligences. Where would it end? At what point does the circumstance of one's creation remove one's right to self-determination?" Judge Caldwell looked directly at White Paw. "This court finds that the being called White Paw has demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt the qualities that define sapient intelligence. Self-awareness, moral reasoning, creative thought, emotional depth, and most importantly, the capacity for autonomous choice. He is not fauna. He is a person." The courtroom exploded with sound. Jake couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Rachel was gripping his shoulder, saying something he couldn't hear through the roaring in his ears. "Furthermore," the judge continued, raising her voice over the noise, "this court grants White Paw legal citizenship status under the advocacy of Jacob Morrison, with full rights and protections afforded to sapient beings. The deportation order is vacated. The containment is lifted immediately. Agent Strauss, remove those restraints." Strauss's face was carved from stone, but he followed the order. The glowing restraints dissolved like smoke, and White Paw stood fully free for the first time since his surrender. The wolf crossed the courtroom in 4 long strides. He pressed his massive head against Jake's chest, and Jake wrapped his arms around White Paw's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath white fur. Proof of life. Proof of personhood. Proof that sometimes, against all odds, the system could get it right. "We did it," Jake whispered. "No," White Paw said softly. "We are free. Both of us." The courtroom was still chaos, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. A broken veteran and a rejected wolf who had found each other and refused to let go. They had proven that worth isn't determined by how you're born or what others think of you. It's determined by your choices, your actions, and your capacity to care. They had won. And the victory would change everything.